Good afternoon. I'm Steve Lowry, the editor of the Hilo. Welcome to this live chat. I do these from time to time. I actually do them quite a lot. And I'm excited about everyone, but I just have to say, this is the one I'm most excited about because we're going to talk about someone that you really should know that I have a feeling you don't know. His name is Millard Sheets. He has long since passed, but he is one of Southern California's greatest artists, and most people don't know that they know him, and you do. We're going to talk with some people, one of whom actually knew Millard Sheets, about moving one of his significant pieces from a bank in Lakewood to what I understand is a secret hiding space for the time being, but that eventually will find its way to the Kleefeld Contemporary at Cal State Long Beach. To help us talk about all that, including some of this cloak and dagger stuff, is Paul Baker-Prindle of the Kleefeld. Hi, Paul.
Hi, how are you?
Here's Brian Worley of Brian Worley Art and Restoration. Brian, hello.
Hola.
And Christina Varvey of R&L Conservation. Hello, Christina.
Hi.
Hello. We're going to talk about all that, but of course, the most important part of this is you at home. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to say, oh, he did that, please let us know, be part of the conversation. So guys, I want to begin with the piece itself. It was at a former home savings. It was actually inside. It's a piece of mosaic mural. How did it come about originally that this thing had to be moved? And Paul, let me start with you. How did the Kleefeld originally get involved in this?
Sure. F&M Bank, homegrown bank here in Southern California, purchased the property that was at one time a home savings bank. As I understand it, it was an early outpost of the branch in Lakewood. I've heard from lots of people who grew up banking there. F&M bought the property a little under a year ago, and they need to change the branch to fit their needs. Banking's changed a lot over the last several decades, especially just since the internet's been invented. So the Mosaic just didn't have a place in that space anymore. And the architect who does all the work for F&M reached out and asked if we'd be interested. We took a look. It really fit our collecting priorities, and we wanted to have a part of preserving Long Beach Lakewood history, and that's what museums do. So it was kind of a match made in heaven for us.
Did you reach out then to Brian?
I reached out to Christina at RLA. RLA does pretty much all of our large-scale sculptural conservation work. As you know, Steve, we have one of the most important outdoor sculpture collections on the West Coast. Began in 1965 at a really pivotal moment in LA Long Beach history. And RLA and Christina have been working on those for a long time, and this was just, it made perfect sense for them to look at it. And as we found out, they had done some work on Millard's work before.
Now, speaking of Millard, Brian, who plays a key role in all of this, actually worked with Millard Sheets, which is just very cool. Brian, can you talk to the significance of this particular mosaic? What, if anything, makes it unique?
Well, a lot makes it unique because the studio that Millard founded and was the driving force in, we produced a lot of mosaics, and most of them were figurative. They were especially the mosaics done for home savings and loan. They tended to draw from the history of the community that the mosaic was going to be located in. So they would have historical figures or representational figures of the type of history, maybe even somewhat romanticized for each location. But in this particular instance, Millard with Lakewood, we did a very interesting design for the planter plinth, whatever you want to call it, outside that had a sculpture situated above it that involved fish and seaweed. But Millard had just come back from a trip to Mexico, and he had an embroidered blouse. And we literally took the design of the embroidery of the blouse, the fabric itself, and converted it into this large scale mosaic, which makes complete sense to me from, my time in the studio, because embroidery and mosaic are sister media.
Mhm.
They relate.
Yeah.
So, but the interesting thing was, we took this small blouse and we blew it up, and it was a very meticulous work, geometrical, but yet the birds created their own element. And it was one of the most distinctive mosaics that I think came out of the studio.
Asia Morris, one of our great reporters here, did a great story about moving the mosaic, and it contains a very short, about 2-minute little kind of mini documentary about how it was moved. Christina, when we were watching that, there was this moment where one of the saws or something actually has to go into the mosaic, and it almost feels painful. It's like, putting it into like the Mona Lisa or something like that. When you were going about the process of planning this thing, I imagine you have to be ultra careful about obviously saving as much as you can, but obviously you have to do a little damage and things like that. What kind of planning goes into something like this, where you can't just unplug it and take it with you?
Sure. And these are projects that we've done in the past as a firm, but also in conjunction with Brian, and I know that he's done on his own. And I would say almost inevitably, without fail, there is some kind of some aspect of slight destructive measures that you have to take, unfortunately, usually because of the size of these things. So the first step is always an initial an investigation. Can you get behind it? Do you drill probes on either side or something that's attached? Are there any drawings? If we could have taken this out in one piece or less pieces, I'm sure we definitely would have. That all goes into the consideration when we're planning this out. What kind of access? How are they attached? What's manageable in terms of we could get into this, or if it has to be moved by hand, what can people carry? So we definitely look at it from all sides and aspects before we make that final decision. Okay, this is the size, this is what we have to do. And even at that point, it's strategic in terms of where we make those cuts. If there's geometric lines, which this lends itself to, there's certain strong horizontal lines in the artwork itself that lend itself to strategic cuts where it's easier to blend. And obviously we don't want to cut through the face of a bird if we can avoid it. We'll stitch it back together, but it's always best if you can avoid the most critical design elements with those kind of cuts.
I know a saying among people who are handy, this would not be me, is you measure twice, you cut once, right? The documentary mostly is about once you're on site doing this. I'm wondering, Christina or Brian, if you could talk to how much preparation went into that. How much was kind of figured out on a sketch pad? This is how we're going to do it. How much math was involved? How much of that pre-stuff did you have to do before you actually got to the mosaic itself?
Well, once you investigate the site and realize that you can access the framing behind the mosaic, that was critical to our developing a plan. And then just understanding the fact that this mosaic in particular was so geometric, that there were locations for us to cut that wouldn't impact the mosaic that much when it's being put back together, understanding that we have tile from that time to replace any tile that we might need to replace. So when we're putting it back together, I'm really confident that we'll be able to to cover those cuts. So it didn't take a lot of thinking in this case. You know, it took a collaborative discussion with Christina, because she'd done a project in Texas recently that gave her, you know, a lot of understanding of what she, you know, what she was faced with. And we just completed a project in Santa Monica of a very different nature, but it's Mosaic is difficult. I mean, Mosaic is pretty unforgiving in terms of removing it, depending on, you know, what the situation is. But Lakewood, fortunately, was perhaps one of the easier removals that Christina or I have experienced, and it can be reconstructed readily. The panel size was determined basically by the geometry, but also by the weight, and what we felt was manageable. To do an economical removal, because you can get heroic. Yeah, you could try to remove it in 3 sections or something, but you know, the cost of removal might not be affordable to anybody.
Christina, Brian, you've mentioned that you've done this multiple times. These things are gorgeous. If you don't know at home, if you grew up with home savings or you go by banks now that have become other things, you know these as those huge murals you see outside that, as Brian described, normally describe what's gone on in the area. A lot of times there's cowboys, a lot of times there's fishermen, these gorgeous, gorgeous kind of public art scenes. I find it amazing. Why would you want to move? They're so beautiful. What's normally the reason that these things have to be transported somewhere else?
Christina, you want to you know,
yeah, I mean,
yeah,
it's a range of things, right? Some, for one that we moved in Texas, it was because it was obscured by other, you know, like trees that had grown up and modifications that they had made to a building. It was a hospital. They wanted to showcase trying to do the right thing, and they relocated it still on their campus. You know, and then you have ones like this where it just it kind of has outlived its life, if you will, in that space, according to someone who had to make that decision. And it's happened elsewhere where, you know, maybe the site is being redeveloped completely, or the building going to be demolished, and they couldn't make a case for designation or things like that. It's really a pretty wide range of reasons.
Yeah, and oftentimes it's just boils down to economics and contemporary notions of viability for development of a site. One of the things that Home Savings did as a strategy was they always picked a prominent corner in a community, and those are often still prominent corners. So, and the footprint of the building compared to the size of the lot, oftentimes nowadays doesn't make economic sense. So developers look at the building and go, I don't need that. I need to build, you know, 4 stories or 6 stories on top of this. It's prime corner. I can make millions, blah, blah, blah. And what do I care about the art?
Well, that's a question I want to ask you, Brian. You know, maybe it's just me. When you see the Chrysler building is a beautiful building. It doesn't need to be. They wanted it that way. Howard Amundsen, who went to Millard Sheets and basically said, I want you to make all my buildings gorgeous, seemed to feel a bit of what would it be like a good corporate citizen does this thing. If we're going to take that corner, we're going to make it beautiful for you. Are we living in different times now where maybe corporate entities don't feel that responsibility anymore?
I would say so. I mean, sadly, if you think about the amount of money that was invested in these buildings, it was significant. But the intriguing thing was that they made that money back by new deposits, generally speaking, within 6 months to a year of opening the building. So, you know, it was a patron of the arts, Howard Amundsen, developing buildings, but knowing that they would pay for themselves. And I just don't know that we see that much in this day and age. There's, you know, the philosophy that Millard had was that art is a part of everyday life, or should be. And it's like I said, it's, you know, art is like breathing air. I mean, it should be all around you, because that creates your environment, and everybody should be appreciative of the environment. And nowadays we get a lot of boxes. We just,
a lot of glass boxes.
We get this or that with a tip of the hat in some form because maybe it's required. You know, a certain percentage needs to be art, but there's no understanding of a philosophy like Millard's that incorporated art into every aspect of a building.
I want to come back to Millard almost immediately, but Paul, we have a question here for you, asking why the Kleefeld felt it was important for you to have this piece. Why is it important to save, conserve this particular piece of history?
Sure. I mean, there are a lot of reasons. I think one, we recognized that F&M would be a good partner in this. I mean, you know, in relationship to your last question, I mean, if you've been in F&M's headquarters downtown, they spent millions restoring that building, which is absolutely incredible. And so we knew that this sort of thing was important to F&M, and that, you know, they'd be good collaborators with us, and they really have been. I think because it's Lakewood, you know, we have people on our board now who grew up in Lakewood. This is this, you know, incredible post-war neighborhood. In fact, you know, the woman after whom our museum is named, her family has a really important tie to Lakewood. And so there were just sort of all sorts of kind of circumstantial things that stacked up. But also, you know, I mentioned this in the little documentary we produced. This work is not figurative. It's unusual among his body of work, and museums are frequently interested in those sorts of moments. So museums tend to collect things that are very representative of an artist's oeuvre, but also these sort of outliers are very important to preserve because they add texture and flavor, right? And our museum is committed to abstraction. We are deeply, deeply invested in exploring what abstraction means, how it functions socially. And this mosaic, it has some really incredible examples of, you know, colorful geometric abstraction that resonates with other things in our collection. Those are all sorts of things that go into those decisions about what makes it into a collection and what doesn't. I often think of collection building as inviting people to a dinner party. You may have 20 friends, but not all 20 of them are going to work great at one dinner party. And so you select among them who's going to make for a great conversation at the table. And we think about collections that way, like how will this work talk with this work and that work with this? And I think for us, it was sort of, I think what's so exciting about Cal State Long Beach is it's a place where mostly working class people go to school. And I think the history of Lakewood as a working class neighborhood made sense to us. And home savings, you know, Amundsen, these were not, that was not a corporate bank. It was an savings and loan. They were community banks. And so it just, everything kind of lined up for us.
That's a great point, Paul. Brian, it's such a privilege to have someone not just be able to talk about Millard Sheets, but as someone who actually worked with Millard Sheets. You knew him as a man. This is a horrible thing to foist on you. Can you give us just a very brief bio of who Millard Sheets was?
Oh boy.
I know.
Millard Sheets was a genius on the order of Walt Disney. He was a contemporary of Disney, and in fact, utilized or knew artists that worked for the Disney studio. But what Millard Sheets was born in Pomona, California, raised by his grandparents. At the age of 18, he was recognized as an artist of significance. He won multiple awards before he was even in his early 20s, and a couple of them national competitions. He's considered the founder of the California watercolor school. And he had many contemporaries that he worked with. He taught at several schools in LA, art schools. And then ultimately he was given the opportunity to sort of create an art department at Scripps College. And he brought in artists of national renown to teach there. And while he was doing that, he was also founding his studio and developing a clientele, primarily Howard Amundsen, for his work. And he wasn't just an artist. I mean, the thing that distinguishes Millard, I think, more than anything is because art is a tough career. A lot of people go for it and don't make it, but Millard was an artist businessman. He was as much a businessman as he was an artist. And he really knew how to talk to people and convince them of the importance of art. And he also was very collaborative. I mean, this studio he created, in creating all the home savings and the Scottish Rite temples in San Francisco and Los Angeles, he employed artists that are nationally known now, like Harrison McIntosh, Sam Maloof.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. Yeah, Sam Maloof, actually, I was Millard's last gopher. And Sam Maloof was one of Millard's first gophers. And Millard supported Sam in getting into furniture making. In fact, Millard was one of his first clients. But Millard was also the director of the what's now the Millard Sheets Art Center at Art Pavilion at the LA County Fair. And he staged exhibitions at the LA County Fair that people that allowed normal people to access art that only international museums would exhibit. I mean, it's phenomenal what some of these exhibits at the LA County Fair incorporated. And it was because he had this reach. He had the ability to draw and bring very high quality museum art to an exhibition at the LA County Fair, so the average person could walk through that pavilion and experience it.
Was that part of his philosophy, that he wanted to do art for the people, not just the kind of people who can afford it? Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And again, you know, the whole notion of home savings was incorporate art throughout. So it wasn't just the exterior mural on the building. I mean, the other side of it is, while he wasn't an architect, Millard designed all of the buildings and then handed his drawings over to staff. At one point, he had, I believe it was 5 architects on staff at the studio doing the drawings. And it related to the interior woodworking. It related to the furniture that was going to be incorporated in the building. Even the lamps, some of, like at the Scottish Rite Temple, Harrison McIntosh and Rupert Deese created these beautiful ceramic bases for lamps. And sadly, they've gone to the winds, but he would bring in all these artists, sculpture at the front of the building, sometimes sculpture inside the building. So it was and stained glass and painted murals inside the building. So it was a complete experience. And
Brian, how much, when we look at this mosaic or one of the murals, how much was he actually with his hands creating this, and how much of it was him directing other people?
By the time I was working there, it was him directing, and in terms of mosaic, it always was. I don't think Millard really got his hands into creating the mosaic. He had a collaboration with Gene and Arthur Ames, who taught at Scripps. They actually, I believe, led him into understanding mosaic. And then in his travels throughout the world, I mean, during the war, he was a reporter for Life magazine, and he painted paintings of watercolors of what he was seeing in battle and the results of battle, and those were published. So but he was traveling in Europe and around the world, so I'm sure he saw all kinds of impressive buildings, and mosaic is part of that. But coming to Claremont, meeting the Ameses, they developed a rapport, and the Ameses were involved in creating some mosaics for churches in Southern California. I think Millard initially tried to get mosaics fabricated in Italy, but he wasn't pleased with the results. And so he developed the studio to create mosaics to the standard that he wanted. And by the time I was there, the studio was really at its peak. And what we were doing was working in a form of mosaic that relates to Byzantine mosaic, not Roman mosaic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was phenomenal. I mean, but that was just one element, the mosaic. Then there was a stained glass, and Sue Hertel, his right-hand person for 30 years, was involved with the design of the mosaics, overseeing the color selection for the mosaics while we were fabricating it. But then she was also doing the stained glass and going to the 2 stained glass studios that we worked with to paint on the glass, and then have that paint fired onto the glass, which you could see at many of the home savings, where there are faces, there's wording, there's all kinds of things. So we were doing that, but then Sue was also painting with Millard a lot of the murals that are on the interior of the banks onto canvas in the studio, and then the canvas was removed and installed like wallpaper in the bank.
Yeah. By the way, if you're a sports fan, Millard Sheets is responsible for what is known as Touchdown Jesus at the University of Notre Dame. It looks like Jesus is saying a field goal is good. That is a massive thing. I've actually taken a picture in front of it with my son. That's Millard Sheets. Paul, I wanted to ask you, Brian mentioned this is a homegrown boy who makes good and does all this art all around the city, all around the region. If this is New York, I can guarantee you everybody knows who this is, right? This is our guy, and he did all this. why don't more people who are from this area, born and raised, why is Millard Sheets' name not on everybody's lips?
That's a tough thing to theorize. I mean, I think part of it, sort of big picture is, for much of art history on the West Coast, we've always been sort of comparing ourselves to New York. And so much of the forms that we engage are sort of replications of what's happening on the East Coast. And, there have been some really great exhibitions over the years that seek to kind of recuperate some of what has been kind of lost to history, but the sort of dynamism of what's happening here. But I mean, I think New York has always just sort of been the catalyst that drives the telling of art history. And so ours is often told relative to it. But of course, we have amazing artists that we celebrate.
Yes.
Baldessari, I mean, it comes to mind. I think one of the challenges, perhaps, and this is just, a guess, and Christina and Brian may agree or disagree, but I think part of it is that so much of this community is about driving. And you see these things, but you don't get out of your car to see signage. And then I think also the thing is like you go, just like today, you go to your bank. And so you might not have gotten an understanding just of how widespread it was. I don't know. I don't have like a totalizing theory for it, but I think also, and this is something that Adam Aronson talks about, what Millard Sheets, a scholar who writes on Millard Sheets, what Millard Sheets was doing was not the main topic of conversation in art circles. And our collection at the museum is very much about what the main topic was, which was mid-century gesturalism, abstract expressionism. And as I understand it from Aronson's scholarship, is Millard Sheets had an appreciation for that and saw it as a valuable artistic pursuit, but he wasn't invested in abstraction himself.
Correct.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and so I think, and I actually think there's a powerful lesson in that. And I think it's something that we're starting to see more and more of, this sort of pluralist approach to art. Like, we've really gotten rid of isms now. We don't talk in isms about what's being made today. I always say to my students, it's like, the human brain is capable of understanding a lot of things. Like, we don't have to put everything in a little box. And I sort of wonder if he was working today, if he might have enjoyed a broader and deeper, awareness, and we wouldn't be having this conversation about how do we recuperate his memory out of history. And
I would say that Millard was overtaken by the abstract movement. He was a representational artist, first and foremost. And, he attained quite a bit of recognition, but this was at a time that the art world was moving towards abstraction. And he wasn't on board. He was who he was. So
that's true of the
I
building.
think over time, he wasn't in the forefront.
Christina, we're running out of time. I could talk about this for another 2 hours. But Christina, the thing has been cut, set aside in a secret location. Again, I want to make that clear. What is the plan now for putting this thing together?
We're actually still in the throes of that now, because it really depends on where it's going in. We have some, basis designs and drawings. We know generally where it's going to go, what the wall is made up of. So coupled with, we removed it, what it looks like on the backside versus where it's going in. Now we work together as a team, and with Paul and with the engineers and the general contractors that are actually building this extension of the museum to finalize how it will be attached to the wall that's going to be built. And if there needs to be any modifications made to accept the weight and the way that we want to install it. Once that's all ironed out and it goes back up on the wall, we do leave a bit of space for the blade that cut it. So we don't want to squish it all back together. And then we remove cut tiles on either side of the line, backfill it, give us some space to add mortar. And then thankfully, Brian has a lot of the original tiles that were used for this, a lot of colors they don't make anymore, and it would be very difficult to match. And they kind of stitch it up and make it seamless and grout it that way. So yeah, we're still working through it. It's always a work in progress, but there's definitely a pathway forward, as we've done in other iterations of moving large scale mosaics.
The internet is rife, Christina, with these kinds of projects gone wrong. There's a couple that have become rather famous. When you're doing it, it was funny, when you and Brian were talking about this, it sounded like someone just adding on to their den or something like that. Oh, we're going to put some plywood and do this and that. You wouldn't know it was this priceless work of art. I'm just curious, when you're doing it yourself, is your stomach a little clenched every step of the way? Like, oh man, don't let me screw this up.
Yeah. To Brian's point, less so on this one. Thankfully, it was a lot more straightforward. When you have other ones where maybe the attachment is the other one that we removed was attached in 3 different kind of manners to the wall. It was like metal studs and wire mesh, and there was some brick behind, and there was concrete. So it was a lot more complex in that regard. So that one's definitely a bit more challenging. I think in terms of getting reinstalled here, once we figure out how we want to attach it, at least in my opinion, the most hold your breath mode when we're installing it, and making sure that it's not faceted, right? You have directional lining up to do of the surface, but just to make sure that when you're looking at an angle or not stepped, that there is usually a slight undulation to most mosaic surfaces because they're put in by hand. Mm-hmm. But noticeable steps, because even if you do all this work to seamlessly stitch it back together with the tiles, if it's offset that way, you'll still see that quote unquote cut line. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be, from my standpoint now moving forward, the most challenging point. But like I said, we've done it before, and I know Brian has other installations. So but to his point, they're beautiful and they're very robust. They can withstand a lot. People have been making mosaics for thousands of years. The color of glass is sometimes hard to match, but they're almost like they're pixelated in a way, right? So you really have some wiggle room in that regard. Thankfully, we don't have to fudge anything. He has all the tiles, but it's it always looks worse before it looks better.
Well, been there. Well, listen, we've gone way over, but I found this completely fascinating, and I think that's what's really important. I enjoyed myself. I want to thank you all for being here, and I would hope that when this thing does go back up, that we all can get back together and talk about how that went and have a look at it. So thanks again for joining us. I appreciate it. And to you at home, we appreciate you being there as always. We'll have another live chat tomorrow at 1 o'clock tomorrow, but enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.